In any discussion of Chinese political and social history, it's good to have a background of the belief systems that people in China practiced throughout history. Sometimes you'll see these called philosophies, sometimes religions. In any case, they help us understand where people in China are coming from and explaining the way their societies are ordered. Keep in mind, this is a really, really brief overview of some of the main belief systems. It's not comprehensive. It doesn't cover all the belief systems you see in China. And B, it doesn't really do a deep dive into some of the intricacies of it. I'll give a few links in the description if you want to get more in depth with some of these. This is meant to be a real brief overview. So one concept you see throughout Chinese history is the idea of the mandate of heaven. This goes way back to one of China's earlier dynasties, the Zhao. The Zhao dynasty had overthrown the Shang, and a lot of the court philosophers at the time were trying to sort of explain why the Zhao were justified in overthrowing the previous dynasty. And the reasoning was this idea that they had this mandate or directive from heaven to rule. And it goes basically like this. Okay, if you have a dynasty that's in charge, a king that's ruling, he must have permission from heaven to rule. And if he didn't, then he wouldn't be in charge. How can you tell he really has permission? Well, if the dynasty's doing well, if people are happy, if the government's prosperous, if there's not chaos and rebellions, the dynasty must be doing a good job. Otherwise, heaven would, throw trouble their way. So if the dynasty's doing well, they must have permission to rule. What happens when things start to go wrong? Well, you'll see, if the king is unjust, if people rebel, if there's natural disasters, and there's poverty and war, that must be heaven expressing displeasure with the dynasty. And that, in fact, gives somebody else permission to overthrow that dynasty. And so the mandate of heaven was something that allowed ruling dynasties to justify their existence. We're doing a good job, we should be in charge. But also it gave people in China, in a way, permission to get rid of a dynasty that was doing a bad job. So, despite this being a really ancient idea, you see it come up over and over again throughout dynastic history. Also, this pattern of dynasties rising and falling, getting the mandate, losing the mandate, somebody else getting it, gets termed the dynastic cycle. So that's another concept you'll see in Chinese history. After the fall of the Zhao dynasty, you see a kind of a political problem in China is that nobody really seemed to be able to hang on to all of Chinese territory. The Zhao had pretty well solidified their control over the heartland of what's today China. And after they fell, no one really gained absolute power. This is called the Warring States period. And there's sort of this question of, well, who's got the mandate? How do we fix society so that things are stable? During this Warring States period, though, you also see a flourishing of political thought. And this is known as the 100 Schools of Thought. Lots of different philosophies, belief systems, kind of started to grow in these different parts of China where you didn't have a single leader in control of everything. And it's out of those 100 schools of thought that we see a few really important belief systems that are going to show up over and over again throughout Chinese history. Probably the most influential is Confucianism. Confucianism was founded by a man named Kongzi, whose name gets Latinized later as Confucius to the Western world. That's why it's called Confucianism. And most of his teachings are recorded in what's called the Analects. These are what his followers wrote down that Confucius said and did. And the key idea in Confucianism is the idea of relationships. Confucius' approach to how do we solve this issue of society's collapse is the main thing is to fix all the relationships in society. He identified 5 key relationships that need to be rightly ordered. Ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, older and younger brother, and friend and friend. And basically said all society is made up of these relationships. If these relationships are rightly ordered, that is to say that subjects follow their rulers, and sons obey their fathers, and wives obey their husbands. Yes, it's patriarchal. And then society can, be successful. And when those relationships aren't rightly ordered, if either the lower person in the relationship isn't obeying the higher one, or the higher one is abusing their power, then society doesn't do very well. And you can see why some rulers would want to use this as an approach to ruling, because it really, tells people, it's really the right thing to do to listen to your superiors. A couple key ideas in this is filial piety. Filial piety is basically the respect that younger people have for their parents. And this is a key idea you see practiced in Confucianism. It spreads throughout Chinese and later other parts of East Asian society. Another idea was the idea of meritocracy. Confucius taught that everyone should be educated, because education is key, and that education should enable people to get some authority. So places that practice Confucianism and dynasties that practice Confucianism often promoted people not based on their status, like, my dad was this ruler, so I'm going to be this job, but more based on skill and merit, hence meritocracy. And you'll see that show up later in things like the civil service exam, where people had to take a test to see if they would be good at ruling. So ideally, Confucianism would be more equitable, that everyone would have access to power. Of course, it didn't always work that way. Another key belief system was legalism. This came from the Qin dynasty, and the head advisor of the king of Qin was Han Fei-tzu. And basically the idea of legalism is people are wicked, they're going to do the wrong thing. The only thing keeping them in power is good, strict, powerful laws. And when the Qin dynasty ends the Warring States period by conquering all their rivals, you see legalism really fall into place. And in fact, a lot of those other 100 schools of thought were crushed under legalist rule. It's not dominant after the Qin dynasty, but you will see a lot of dynasties borrow parts of legalism to justify their own harsh laws. And then finally you have Taoism. Taoism was supposedly started by a man named Lao Tse in around 500 BC, so about during the same time. And one of the key texts of Taoism is the Tao Te Ching, or Way of Virtue. And the idea of Tao is that there's a natural path or way in nature. Tao means way. And if people were to follow that way, then life would be better. The basic idea of Taoism is go with the flow. Don't try too hard. Nature will guide you where you need to go. Which doesn't sound like a really strong way to rule. Like, it's hard to set up a political system that way. You will see some later dynasties use parts of Taoism to justify their rule. So think of Taoism as basically sort of following the natural order of society, not trying to force order on top of it like you see in legalism or Confucianism. But all parts of these philosophies will be used throughout Chinese history.